Hi Year 8, it's Mrs Eleanor here, and I've got some delightful news for you. And that news is that you're going to be doing an assessment the week beginning, the first week of July. It's an end of year assessment and it will be on Year 7 work and Year 8 work, very, very similar to the one that you completed in January. So the first slide of this PowerPoint, and this PowerPoint is a revision PowerPoint to get you started on the revision that you're going to need to do to complete that assessment. The assessment is on Schoology. You will need your Schoology log-on in order to see that assessment. It's going to be called something like Year 8 Assessment Number 2. If you don't know your Schoology log-on, then you can email me and myself and Mrs Warriner will sort it out. Now, the assessment, as I say, it will be like the January one. There will be quite a few multiple choice questions to test your knowledge. There will be a source question and a piece of extended writing. Okay, so this lesson, I'm going to go over some of the things that you're going to need to do to prepare for that assessment. So, as usual in my lessons, there is the learning intention and the success criteria. So the learning intention is you're going to revise the French Revolution and the British Industrial Revolution. That's two topics that you have studied in Year 8. We've also got a stretch and challenge question there. How similar is the French Revolution to the English Civil War? Now, that's another topic that you studied in Year 8, right at the start of Year 8, and you will need to revise that as well. So the French Revolution and the English Civil War, they do have some similarities, and hopefully this revision lesson will jog your memory as to how both those aspects of history are similar. So the success criteria, by the end of this lesson, hopefully you will be able to recall some key facts. And I'm also going to talk you through how we assess the usefulness of a historical source, because that will be the source question on your assessment. Usefulness. Are they useful for a particular inquiry? Okay, so let's start with the first topic. What were the key features of the French Revolution? Now, obviously, you can pause this and you can shut me up by pausing it. You can't do that in class. But anyway, you can pause this and read this on your own, but I'm just going to run through a few things about the French Revolution. So as you can see, the French Revolution, what was it? It was a period in history for about 10 years, 1789 to 1799, where France saw huge political changes and changes to society as well. So France went from being a monarchy to a republic. Now, France had been a monarchy for hundreds and hundreds of years, and in 1793, that came to an end when Louis XVI, the King of France, was executed. So France becomes a republic, that is a country that does not have a king or queen. So why does this happen in France? You can see a few causes there on the next bullet point. Well, French society had been unfair for centuries. You might remember from class there were 3 estates in France, and what this means are like 3 social classes. If I just remind you of that very quickly, there was the first estate, the second estate and the third estate. People in the first estate were clergymen, men who worked for the church, priests, vicars, bishops. People in the second estate were the nobility, so basically the king's friends, rich people, people who owned lots of land, and everybody else, which was about 97% of the population, were in the third estate. So that was kind of doctors, teachers, lawyers, but also poor people who worked the land like peasants. Now, it was only the third estate that paid taxes, and of course you can see yourself that's very, very unfair. Another big cause of the French Revolution was that the monarchy was bankrupt. We might remember Louis's wife, Marie Antoinette. She liked to spend money. She liked to play in Le Petit Trianon, which was a special village for her to pretend she was a French peasant, which you can imagine upset people. So loads and loads of money was spent on this village and on Marie Antoinette. She liked to gamble. And eventually, the French monarchy ran out of money. So Louis wanted a new tax, and he started to say, can I tax the first and second estate? And they said no. And the only way he could raise a new tax was to call a meeting of the Estates General, which he did in May 1789. Now, this was where representatives from all the different estates in France came to Paris. And it was the first time anyone in the Third Estate had ever been asked their opinion about anything. So, of course, they weren't interested in Louis's tax and Louis XVI's financial problems. They wanted a say in how France was run. And if you remember how this ended, it ended in disaster and arguments, and the Third Estate members basically stormed out and they made a promise on a nearby tennis court, and that was that they would not leave Paris until they were granted a constitution, which is a list of rules as to how the country would be run, which even the king would have to follow. Now, that very important promise was called the tennis court oath. So we can see the revolution kind of starting to take off here in May 1789. So all of that, French society, the bankruptcy of the monarchy, all of that combined with poor harvests, which led to food shortages, led to the revolution in France. Now, if you move down to the next bullet point, several very important events happened during the French Revolution, which of course we studied in class. So the first big thing was the storming of the Bastille on the 14th of July 1789. And as you all know, this is France's national day today, 14th of July. They have a day off. It's a national holiday. Bastille Day, it's called. Now, the angry mob, remember, they're hungry, they're having to pay taxes, France is falling into chaos. They stormed the hated prison in Paris. They released not many prisoners in there, there's about 6 prisoners in there. They released the very few prisoners in there, they chop the head off the governor, and they seize weapons. So it's all getting out of hand in Paris. Later that year, women marched to Versailles, in the March of the Women in October 1789, and they demand food. They're like, we want bread. And of course, this is where Marie Antoinette says her famous kind of callous quote, which is, let them eat cake. So Marie Antoinette completely misunderstanding the situation, let them eat cake. The women and some men are on this march as well, and some soldiers. They bring Louis and Marie Antoinette back to Paris where they can keep an eye on them. They're a bit fed up of them living a life of luxury at the Palace of Versailles. Now, Louis and Marie Antoinette, Louis particularly, they don't like this. Louis doesn't like being told what to do. So after 2 years of living in the Tuileries Palace in Paris, they disguise themselves as servants and they try to escape, and they're trying to head to Austria to get Marie Antoinette's Austrian brother to declare war on France and restore the king to his rightful powerful place. That's called the flight to Varennes, because of course they get recognised at Varennes and they get led back to Paris. Now you can see the last little bit. The revolutionaries, the people in France, they can't trust the king anymore. He's committed treason. He's tried to get another country to declare war on his people. So of course, to cut a long story short, Louis is executed in January 1793. Marie Antoinette is executed later that year. The Reign of Terror then comes in, where the guillotine is used to kill loads and loads of people, and other countries begin to declare war on France. And you can see there the results of the French Revolution were the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. That's another topic you need to revise, and the Revolutionary Wars. So that's a very quick run through the French Revolution, just to remind you of what you need to know. Oh, and there's Napoleon. Very famous picture of Napoleon, which many of you know is also in my classroom. So the next topic I just want to run through is the Industrial Revolution. Now you were set work on this at home. Now the Industrial Revolution, again, you can pause me, hit pause on here, and you can read through this in your own time. But just to give you a quick overview, the Industrial Revolution was when Britain changed from an agrarian country, that is a country that is predominantly countryside, rural, to an urban industrialised one. So people began to move from the countryside to the towns and the cities. And as you can see on the PowerPoint here, Britain became known as the workshop of the world, as manufacturing industry and trade expanded. Now there are several aspects to the Industrial Revolution. and they are all linked, really. I'll try and explain that as we go through. But the first thing that sort of kicks it all off is the population explosion. Now, for lots of reasons, like medical care's getting better, food's getting better, the agricultural revolution, there's better quality food. The government put a massive tax on gin, so people can't drink so much gin, therefore they're not dying of alcohol-related illnesses. The population exploded in Britain between 1750 and 1900, and that fueled some of the other changes. So I'll just give you a quick example of that explosion. In 1750, the population was about 7 million. In 1900, just 150 years later, it was 35 million. So you can do the maths on that one, but it's a massive increase. Whizzing down those bullet points, the agricultural revolution happened. Farming changed, but because of the population explosion, more food was needed. And for example, fields were joined together, that was called enclosure. Farming became mechanized, new machinery was used, and people experimented with breeding different types of animals to create meat. Factories emerged. Now, machinery needing water or steam power was invented to make more clothes. Therefore, textile factories emerged because you couldn't put these machines in your home because you needed a water wheel. Now, one such machine was Richard Arkwright's water frame. Okay, which was a loom that wove cloth, and it needed water power. And one of the first factories, possibly the first, was Arkwright's factory in Cromford in Derbyshire. So Richard Arkwright is known as the father of the factory system. Factories became very, very controversial places because of the mass use of child labour and the cruel practices that went on there. The long hours, the low pay, the employment of a man called the strapper who would hit the children if they weren't working hard enough. Plus, of course, the machinery wasn't fenced off, and children often got caught in the machinery and had horrendous accidents. Coal mines developed to power these machines by steam power. You needed lots of coal. Also, to heat homes for a growing population, more coal was needed, and so mines were dug. Again, the conditions weren't great for the workers, but we could use this coal, we could transport it around Britain, we could sell it around the world, and it made Britain quite rich. As all this is happening, towns and living conditions were not great. Industrial towns developed, and as people lost their jobs in agriculture, they moved to the towns to find work in the factories. Housing was built very quickly, back-to-back housing, very poorly ventilated. Sometimes a family lived in one room and a family lived in the room upstairs. Sometimes hundreds of people would share the same privy, which is a toilet on the street. So in those conditions, there was disease, there was ill health, and there began to be lots of concern during the Industrial Revolution about public health in the towns. Okay, so the last point there is transport developed. Another big part of the Industrial Revolution is it's okay producing all this coal, all this pottery, all these textiles, everything that's being produced, but you've got to get it from A to B. You've got to get it from where it's being produced to the people who are buying it. So people like Thomas Telford built roads, canals were built, and railways developed. And one of the first trains was built by George Stephenson. You may have heard of the Rocket, 1829. So that's a quick run through the Industrial Revolution. So I'm moving on to the next slide here, and I want to just go through some skills in history. Now, we use sources to find out about the past in history. So it tells you there on the sheet, historians use sources to find out about the past, but are sources useful for a particular inquiry? So in the kind of brownish box at the bottom, it says, how can we assess whether a source is useful for a particular inquiry? Well, the most important way a source can be useful is the content. What does it tell you? What does it suggest? What does it infer about what you're trying to find out about? So we'll look at a question in a minute. Nature. What is the source? Is it a book? Is it a letter, diary, photograph, painting? And how does that affect how useful it is? The origin, who produced it, where and when? How does this affect how useful it is? For example, is it produced by somebody who was there? Is it an eyewitness? Is it a historian writing many years later who's had time to research and find out? Okay, and purpose. Now this is linked to nature. So why do you think the source was produced? So if it's a letter, why was it produced? If it's a book, why was that produced? And does that make it more useful or less useful? Now, to get the really high marks on this sort of question, does your own knowledge support the source? Do you know anything that agrees with the source that then makes you think, yes, that source is useful? Or, you could be really clever, do you have any own knowledge that's not in the source? Okay, so we've got a source there, source A, written by a factory worker in 1800. Okay, we don't know where this factory was, we don't know who he was, but there it is. If we just read through that source, it says, we used to gather potatoes before we came here. When not doing that, I used to mend fences or make baskets. We came to the factory 5 years ago. It's regular work, you see. I work on spinning machines and my family still works with me. The wife helps the machine operator and the kids clean. Paid once a fortnight, family wage in my pocket. Mind you, I miss the freedom. When you're your own boss, you work when you like. Now it's all clock, clock, clock. Right, so how useful, here's the question, let me get that up there. How useful is source A for an inquiry into factory conditions during the Industrial Revolution? So, what does it tell you about factory conditions? What does it mean, clock, clock, clock? No one's answered that, so I'll have to tell you. It means when they turned up at the factories, they had a clocking in card so that the owners knew what time they got there. They then had to clock out. If they were late, they were fined. So they're working to a clock. They're working to a time. So you see, they don't really like that. You're not your own boss. Tells you a little bit about what sort of machines were in the factories, and it tells you that his children were there as well. So it's fairly useful looking at the content. Then you have to think, what is it? Okay, what is it? It's an account. Who's it by? By somebody who worked there. Why did he produce it? Not sure on that. Could it have been an interview? Could it have been somebody trying to find out about what life was like in the factories? But the interesting thing is own knowledge. Do you have any own knowledge that either agrees or disagrees with that source? Does it tell you everything? If you do your revision, you will know that it doesn't. I'll leave it at that. So that's it, Year 8. I've gone through, let's just check that we've done it, the success criteria. I've gone through 2 aspects of Year 8, the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution. I can recall key facts. We went through a few. Can you now tell me a cause of the French Revolution? Can you tell me an event of the French Revolution? Can you tell me something about the Industrial Revolution in Britain? And what I've tried to get you to think about is how you can assess the usefulness of historical sources. Okay, as usual, I've probably gone on far too long. You know what I'm like in school, I like to talk. So, hope this is useful for you. Email me if you want to ask any questions, and hopefully this gives you a little bit of a start on what you should be revising. Take care, hope to see you all soon. Bye-bye.